Cool, lovely. Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining my talk. As Dan said, I work in API governance. API governance is my thing. And today I'll be talking about automating API governance, how to accelerate the delivery of high quality, secure APIs. A little about me, as Dan introduced, my name is Ikenna Nwaiwu. I'm an API consultant I live in London, even though I'm talking from Brussels today. This is my book, which the print version is going to be released in July, but you can get the digital version right now from the Manix website. It's called Automating API Delivery, API Ops with OpenAPI. And it just has a lot of the experience I've had in terms of automating API governance with API, API ops, that kind of stuff, and just compressing all that knowledge into one book. So yeah, do get it, and I hope you enjoy. Today, I'm going to be first of all, I will be kind of bring something maybe a little bit different from some of the security stuff we'll be talking about, and I'll start with actually running a survey to see what we think, for as many as are on the call, see what we think about API governance and where we are with API governance, just a quick survey. And then I'll talk about the typical problem that occurs with API governance when we start to scale building APIs. And to tackle those problems, I will talk about some foundations we need in place, some people, process, technology mindsets we need in place to tackle those governance and scale problems. And then I'll leave us with a few tips on how to go about automating API governance. Okay, so now I'm going to ask that we do a small survey. If you're used to Slido, please, if you have the Slido app, you can open it and enter in the following code, 3259442. If you don't have the Slido app, just quickly go to www.slido.com on your mobile phone. And you should see there, once you enter this code, you should see a survey. The survey has 3 questions, and I'd like us to do that in the next 5 minutes. So if you can, just jump on it and we'll go through the questions. Just start filling in the questions as soon as you can. Okay, so the first question there says, my organization designs, builds, and manages APIs. So that's a yes or no kind of answer you should give to that one. You know what? I'll just go back just in case anyone didn't get that Slido code. It's there you go. It's through 3259442. Let me just check. Okay, cool. I think we're getting some answers coming in. We're getting some answers. Okay, 2 people on there. That's good. Cool, good stuff. We're getting people in and clicking those buttons. Very good. Thank you very much. So first, like I said, first question is, does the organization build APIs? Let's, let us know. The second question is, in my organization, our teams, including non-devs, can easily find any of our API descriptions or API specs or, Swagger or OpenAPI or whatever you use, GraphQL, any other API definitions. And there is a central place to search, read, and retrieve your API descriptions. Yeah, you have some central catalog where everyone can go and find your API specifications, and it's complete, it's accurate, and anyone can use it. Yeah. So that's the second question. The third question is, we have automated controls in place to ensure that security best practices are followed during API design. Okay, so if I'm trying to design an API, and we've just been talking about Boolean errors. Say I start using just integers, simple integers as identifiers. Is there some automated way I can know that I'm doing something wrong at API design time? If you have something like that in your organization, do let us know. So these are Likert style questions. So they go from agree, disagree, strongly agree, and so on. So do let us know. Oh, cool. We're getting some results coming in, and I'm just looking at my phone. So about we've got 25 people, I think, feel this, and most people, 84%, involved in designing and building APIs. So that's interesting. In terms of regarding the question about there's a central catalog where all the APIs are stored. There's a central inventory of APIs. The highest number of respondents, 38%, disagree. Okay. In fact, if you add that with the strongly disagree, okay, so there's no strongly disagree, there's just 0%. So the disagree is 38%. So roughly 40% do not have an API catalog or one central API catalog. API definitions are scattered maybe in different places. Okay, that's a really interesting result. And for the third question, we have automated controls in place to ensure that security best practices are followed during API design. The highest number of respondents, 29%, disagree. Okay, so most people do not have automated controls at API design time to check for some of these API security issues at design time. Following on from that, 29% is 29% neither agree or disagree. So maybe they don't know, they're unsure. So from these results, we can see that, broadly, organizations can have issues around API governance, around putting in rules, putting in controls to make sure that APIs are designed, built, deployed, following the organization standards. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so let me talk about this problem of scaling API development, because these things usually occur at scale. It's fine when it's a small team of, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 people working on an API. But when we start talking about teams of, 20, 30, 40 teams, these problems come up. We start having these inconsistencies. So let's look at a hypothetical example. Let's imagine an organization called Acme, and Acme is starting out on this. Is Acme starting to build APIs? Acme has, say, a monolithic application that they're trying to kind of maybe move to the cloud and build it, kind of re-architect it in a microservices, following a microservices architecture, move to the cloud. They're trying to break it down into build APIs to enable them. Maybe their monolithic application just had a front-end web app, and that was all they used. But now they're kind of moving to an API-first way, where, yes, they'll have a web front-end, but they will also have mobile. They also have third parties integrating with their APIs. So trying to do all this API-first approach to building their platform. And the reason they're doing this is to, number one, create new revenue opportunities, right? Unlock new business models so that third parties can use the capabilities exposed to their APIs by their APIs to generate new business. They want to improve API adoption, get more customers using their APIs and their business capabilities. They want to improve operational efficiency, make it cheaper, get more stuff for less. And also accelerate innovation. They want to make it easy for anyone in the organization to find out the business capabilities exposed by their APIs and make business decisions based on that. Think about new ways to create new products based on their APIs, okay? So this is kind of the vision. This is what they want to do with the APIs, and that's great. Now, what we find is practically problems arise when they try to do this, okay? So typically organizations like Acme, they find, they have the problem we've seen of API discovery. Where are my APIs? Just as we've seen in this survey, it's in large organizations, it can be a problem to find the one place where all the API definitions are. API specs are scattered everywhere, and this discovery is an issue. The other thing is inconsistent APIs. Not everyone follows the same guidelines around the API design, around API security practices, authentication, authorizations. You have problem there. APIs are insecure by design. Sometimes there are frequent breaking changes because frequent API breaking changes that disrupt customers, because again, everyone is not following the organization's API style guide or organization standards. And there's a problem of API drift where the API documentation differs from the actual behavior of the API. And so the API documentation or API spec is incorrect. And if you're trying to use the API spec, say, to do some validation in your API gateway or some other API security platform, you have a problem there because the API, OpenAPI document definition or or JSON schema or whatever else you use as the API definition is incorrect. So these are all problems that organizations face when they try to scale their API development. Now, the question is, how do you solve this problem? Okay, how do you solve this problem? And the key thing to solving this problem really is putting together the processes, the technology, the teams in place that would build the automation, putting the processes to tackle these things. And to be able to put in that this kind of solution, this not just technology solution, but the processes, the people, the teams. There are a few. There's a mindset. There are a mindset, the team structures we need to understand. There are a few foundations we need to understand to be able to build this. I'll call this API platform function that will enable us putting the practices that would help us putting that automated governance, reliable governance. So I'll walk through these foundations one by one. There are 5 I want to talk about. 4 of them. The first is API as a product mindset, and API as a product mindset. The second is API governance. Third is API architecture, and the fourth is platform engineering. So let's talk about the API as a product mindset. Now, what's this about? It's really about thinking about an API as a product, using that, having a user-centric way of thinking about APIs, and applying product management principles to APIs. So not just seeing APIs as some sort of data transfer, just for data transfer, but thinking about applying product management principles to it to make sure we build APIs that users would love to use, that are secure and all that. And there's a bunch of principles around this, or ideas around this API as a product. The first one is that it's important to understand who's using the API. Okay, so who's the consumer? What they trying to do? The product managers will call this the kind of what's the job to be done. So understanding the consumer of the API. There's also understanding the business capability we want to expose via the API. It's also important to understand, is there going to be any pricing plans? How is the user going to use this? Is it free? Is it some tiered pricing, or some other kind of a business model around the API? It's also important to understand the journey the user of the API goes through to discover the API, to get onboarded, and start using the API, testing the API. Do they find it on a kind of a developer portal? Do they have access to a sandbox? So going through all those touch points and making sure that we design those touch points so that the user would have a great journey in terms of getting to use the API. And while doing that, obviously, it implies providing documentation and support to enable the user do that. But it also involves defining some KPIs, right, on how some metrics on how we will use to judge if the API is successful. If we're really thinking about the API as a product, how do we gauge when it's successful? Are we measuring the number of active users, of the daily active users or monthly active users of the API? Are we measuring the general API usage? Are we measuring the time to first transaction? Are we measuring some sort of conversion ratio as the people start using the API? Maybe they hit a particular business goal along the journey of using that API. So these are things product managers who think about when we thought, or we should think about generally when thinking of an API as a product. Again, there should be some sort of assigned product manager who wears that hat of thinking about these things, thinking about the user when designing or putting together the API. So this is really the first foundation, the managing API as a product mindset. The second one here is about API architecture, something we're all kind of familiar with, which is around all the things we put together. API architecture is really about how we organize APIs in our software platform, how they collaborate, interact with each other. And there's so many things, to talk about: API design, security, testing, error handling, performance, how we deploy the API, observability, things like that. So So many things to think about from the architecture front. Then we talk about governance. So this is really dwell on this a bit. So API governance is really, again, putting together those common rules around API documentation, about API testing, about API around API deployment, putting together those common rules and standards that we expect everyone in the organization to follow to make sure the APIs are designed in a secure way, in a user-friendly way, and to maximize business value. And so this is one of the first ones we talked about when we did the survey, right? The API has to be discoverable. API assets, people have to be able to find them, to use them. We need to make sure they're well documented and comprehensive. We don't want missing API definitions, and no one, people say, well, where's my API? Where's my API definition? The APIs have to be consistent with our style guide. They need to follow the organization's standards and practice, recommended standards. And also they need to conformant here, or you could use the word, there should be no API drift. Okay, so API drift is bad because people raise documentation defects, and it can lead to security issues as well when what we think is the API description or specification is actually incorrect. And there's also reusability, we should be able to reuse, common API error libraries or API components and not kind of rebuild the wheel. Of course, our APIs need to be secure, and we need to make, putting rules to make sure we're putting the right, authentication, authorization, and every other thing that comes with it to make sure that the API is really secure. Okay. But there's also things about using a common data model. We don't want APIs where the same concept is given different names, 2, 3 names for the same thing. It can be very confusing to a user. And it's about using that ubiquitous language, common data model in the organization to describe these business capabilities, whether they're exposed via, web APIs, event APIs, or things like that. The API should be easy to use, and of course, it should be well versioned to guide the evolutionary path of the API. We don't want breaking changes. We want a really clear path to evolve APIs that doesn't disrupt the user of the API. So this, in a nutshell, are some of the key themes around API governance, which is the second foundation there. And then we talk about, what was that third foundation? I think I've lost count. Then we have platform engineering, okay, which really is about putting together the software kind of tools, web portals, APIs, CLIs, golden path templates, putting together all the necessary tools that teams need to then build applications, okay? And that can be providing it through one single plane, so-called single plane of glass, one sort of internal developer portal where feature teams, engineering teams can go and find all they need to self-serve and build the applications they need. So this is where kind of platform engineering comes into that. Now, why do I mention all these different teams? Because when we put all these together, it enables us then build, let's call it an API platform team or an API platform function, okay? Which is how we can put in the automation, the safeguards, the controls to make sure the problem that Acme had doesn't happen, okay? I love this definition of an API platform from Jordi Fernandez at Kong. He describes an API platform as it embodies the strategic orchestration of technology and governance assets to expedite and enhance the work of internal API stakeholders. An API platform integrates not just technology components, but also people and the processes involved. So thinking about this is, organizations need to mature their API platform to be able to provide these secure and well-governed APIs. I'll just quickly touch on this. This is a kind of the key thing, to think about in terms of people, processes, and technology for putting in a mature API, a platform team or API platform function to enable organizations to kind of do that. So they need to, these are some of the things I've mentioned, provide API architecture support, API design, governance, and support, common tooling, things like that, API style guides with security recommendations. All these are things that organizations need to do. Okay, now I've talked a lot about, I've provided the core foundations that need to be in place, and I've talked about the API platform function that needs to be mature based on those 4 foundations. Once we have that, we can then talk about the practical ways we can start providing this automation. Because then if you have a well-functioning API platform team or API platform function, it doesn't need to be one team. It can be multiple teams or multiple people collaborating. But then when you have that, you can then start this automation, okay? And then the first practical tip, so I'll just give, for time reasons, I'll just give 2 practical tips there on automating API governance. The first one is that, yes, have an internal API registry. Just like we saw from our survey, it's so important to have a central store, a central catalog of your API definitions that's correct, that's comprehensive. It doesn't matter if you use, an internal developer portal like Backstage, where you can store your OpenAPI specs there, or you use Apicurio registry, a tool I recommend, a great tool, open source tool from Red Hat. I think you can deploy that, and it is a great API registry you can use, or Swagger Hub, which is a commercial offering, another great tool you could use. But it's good to have that. Yes, store your API definitions in source control. That's a good place to start. You can publish them to an API registry where they can be consumed by humans, browsed by humans, downloaded and things, but also retrieved. These systems usually have an API that other applications can use to retrieve the API definitions if required. And then for organizations that have an external API consumers, not all organizations do, but for some that do, you can have an external facing consumer developer portal where you can also publish your API definitions. The second thing you can do is to run API consistency checks, or you can also call that API linting. And this is a way to check, how consistent your API definitions or your API design is with your API style guide. Again, these are the things you do at the design stage. So in the previous talk, we're talking about shift left or shift smart or expand left, but these are things you could do at that kind of, making sure your APIs are securely designed. And so linting is something that's really helped there, that can really help there. It's just the automated analysis of your API definition files to check, like I said, for compliance with your style guide. There a few popular API linting tools. Spectral is one you might have heard of. Most people use that. It's incorporated into such tools like as Postman. So it's a very popular one. But there's also Vacuum, which is a more recent offering that is extremely fast and has the OWASP API top 10 rule set embedded in it. So it's a really great one. I recommend that. There's Reductly CLI, another great API linting tool I kind of love. That has lots of other useful features around change management on API definition files. So these are great tools you can use to run API linting and make sure that your API follows the style guide and security standards at design time. And here's just a simple example of how to do what I've just said. Okay, say you're using Vacuum, which I talked about. You can just run a lint command, provide the rule set, the OWASP rule set. You just need to declare it. It's literally a one line you need to declare there, and it would run the preset rule set it has for the OWASP API security top 10. And you provide your API definition. In this case, I've called the crappy.api.yaml. And when you run that, you should get some results like you see there, which will tell you, in this case, it says, don't use numeric IDs, use random IDs that cannot be guessed. For example, like UUIDs. So this is an example, if you had in that API, in that path there, if video ID was just an integer, 1, 2, 3, 4, we're talking about Bola errors, in the previous talk. This is one way we could kind of try and avoid this kind of stuff, at design time by using, say, UUIDs instead. So that's an example of where a linting can help. And I'll just kind of bring things to a close and wrap this up to just provide a quick summary of what I've talked about. So I started by talking about this execution gap. So we did our survey, but I also talked about this execution gap where yes, companies can start with, they can have a grand vision of how they want their APIs to do all this really great stuff for them. But when it comes to executing it, if they don't have a mature API platform function, then they can fall down because they don't have the processes, the tools, the people, the technology to make sure that they consistently, govern those APIs reliably and deliver it right, every time. The four themes I mentioned that we need to think about, have in our mind when approaching this API platform function is, API as a product thinking, which puts at our forefront how important APIs are, API architecture, API governance, of course, and of course, platform engineering, which is the enabler, the enablement team to the feature teams that actually do the API design. And again, I talked about some practical things we could do, creating an API registry. You can ignore the other ones. In this case, I'm just mentioning two. Have an API registry and automate your API consistency checks, your API linting. So I'm going to wrap it there. I think I'm probably out of time, but that's my book, and there's a discount code if you're interested in getting that. You can get about 45% off. Do join me on LinkedIn if you haven't already, and yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah, bring that slide back. Yeah, make sure people can see it.
Let me.
Yeah.
Okay.
And thank you for the kind offer to the community here. Definitely recommend folks keep tabs on Ikenna. The book is excellent if you want to if this is an area of interest for you, and a very reachable guy. I mean, I've gotten to know Ikenna over the last few months, and just definitely recommend you follow up here. Here we did get a question or two here, so let me put this one up here.
Shall I stop sharing, perhaps? So yeah.
Sorry.
Shall I stop sharing now?
No. Keep it up for a second. I want people to see your links there. Unfortunately, we don't have clickable links on this platform, so people have to type them in by hand. Yeah. But how is API risk and compliance handled? That's a big question there. How do you want to handle that one?
No, that's a really good question. In fact, one thing in governance is to think risk first, right? And this is one thing I recommend with organizations I work with, is to first start by, because you can be overwhelmed. There's so much to do. Where do you start? If you start from technology or process, you're just going to be overwhelmed. The first thing to start with is the risk. Analyze your organization. Look for what risks you have. What are your biggest risks, and start your process improvements from there. Okay. Some organizations can have that at the deployment stage. Maybe they have very, the way they deploy their APIs is quite unreliable, error prone, or insecure. That's the place to start with. So I'll say work very closely with compliance or legal or audit or whatever you call it in your organization. Work with them to identify the key risks. Again, this is where you would need to work with the API architects and other stakeholders. Once you've identified them, those are the starting points of your improvement efforts and automation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And before we wrap up here, again, a couple of comments you made that I found interesting. One was the API as a product, and this feels to me like a mental shift that we see. Like some organizations I talk to, they have API product managers. They really treat APIs as products. They have that religion, if you will. And then others, I don't know if you've seen this, like APIs are that's just that thing that comes along with building the other stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Dan. That's just so true. And the power behind this about thinking about APIs as a product is that it really unlocks business value. It's not just a fad, if I'll use that word, because it's so important for people to understand that once business capabilities are well exposed via APIs, then it really unlocks potential for companies to think about more creative ways they could, resell those capabilities, integrate with partners, and do more stuff to generate revenue. And that really is the power of it. And so this is why business people should be really interested in that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And on that, let's wrap it up, and Ikenna, maybe we can do some further sessions down the road, because I think there's a lot more to talk about here.
Yeah.
But thanks for making time for us in your crazy schedule. Enjoy Brussels, and we see you next time.
Thank you so
let's, yeah, thank